In Beijing, China, just after dusk in the year 1908, a secretive group departs from the Forbidden City. This group includes servants, mounted imperial guards, and the palace chamberlain. It is an official entourage with both escort and security responsibilities. However, they are not escorting anyone out of the city. Instead, they are on a mission to retrieve someone. Their journey leads them north to a mansion with red gates, the residence of Prince Chun. The prince is unaware of any visitors, but the imperial convoy has not come for him. Their true purpose is to find his 2-year-old son. Startled by the unfamiliar faces, the young boy hides inside a cupboard. The servants attempt to remove him and take him along, but he resists fiercely. He cries out, weeps uncontrollably, scratches and wails in distress. After much effort, they manage to soothe him, and he is brought back to the Forbidden City. This small child has just been selected to become the ruler of China. His name is Puyi, and he is destined to be the next emperor of the Qing dynasty, a role in which the Chinese people will view him as a divine being. This video draws heavily from the remarkable book, The Last Emperor, by Edward Baer. You can find the link in the description. The scene is Puyi's coronation ceremony, and the young child is overwhelmed. For what feels like an endless stretch of time, people have marched past him. Unknown men utter unfamiliar phrases. Ministers, palace guards, officers, and numerous officials. Each approaches and performs a ceremonial act of loyalty, kneeling 3 times and pressing their foreheads to the ground 9 times, a gesture known as a kowtow. Every individual declares their loyalty, reciting words that hold no meaning for the small child. To this 2-year-old boy, the entire event is confusing and terrifying. The only person who could soothe him, reassure him, and make him feel secure is absent, his wet nurse. Puyi isn't permitted to be with his mother, and Nurse Wang has taken over the maternal role. She plays with him, nurses him, and sleeps beside him. She is his greatest source of comfort and his dearest companion, yet she has been deliberately left out of the ceremony. Puyi starts to squirm. In addition, he feels cold. The grand hall is freezing. He turns to his father, Prince Chun, and tells him he wants to return home. Then the boy begins to weep. Prince Chun is at a loss. No occasion could be more significant than this coronation, and it needs to proceed smoothly. He attempts to reassure his son, telling him that it will all end soon. These words might have calmed little Puyi. But to the palace staff who overhear the remark, the phrase seems ominous, as though it foretells not just the nature of the young emperor's reign, but also the looming downfall of the Qing dynasty itself. The Qing dynasty had risen to power in 1644, when the Manchu, an ethnic minority, seized control from the Han Chinese, who made up the majority population. The Han Chinese people, who represent the majority ethnic group in China, had long been ruled by the Qing dynasty, which at its height in 1790 became the 4th largest imperial dynasty in recorded history. By the time young Puyi was crowned, China had the largest population of any nation on earth. When the toddler ascended the throne, he became the sovereign ruler of nearly 1/3 of the global population. For over 2 millennia, China's political system had been dominated by dynastic rule, and throughout that time, the emperor's authority remained virtually absolute. Officially, his power was boundless. The Qing emperor, on paper, may well have been the most powerful individual alive. Yet in reality, both the empire and its ruling house had been in steady decline for quite some time. Continuous internal conflicts had gradually eroded the strength of the monarchy, culminating in what might appear to be a strange event. But in truth, Puyi was not crowned emperor, despite his tender age, but rather because of it. The woman behind this choice was Empress Dowager Cixi, also known as the Dragon Lady. Selected in her youth to be one of the emperor's concubines, she seized power after his passing and went on to effectively govern China as Empress Dowager for nearly half a century. In order to cling to authority, she consistently appointed very young boys as emperors, mere figureheads. But as the most recent of these puppet rulers began to grow up, tensions escalated. Now gravely ill, that boy emperor was on the brink of death. Cixi, determined to maintain control, was prepared to do whatever was necessary. After China's defeat in the war against Japan, the country was left heavily indebted. As part of the reparations, Cixi permitted foreign powers to seize control of land and valuable national assets. China grew increasingly weak. Its people suffered under hardship, and the Forbidden City turned into a place brimming with political intrigue and scheming. Under immense stress and battling failing health, Cixi urgently needed a new child puppet to keep her grip on power. Legally, as long as Puyi remained a minor, his father, Prince Chun, would serve as regent. He was both loyal to Cixi and widely regarded as incapable, an ideal combination for her purposes. Once little Puyi was taken from his home, everything seemed to align in her favor. Just as she had anticipated, the previous emperor died the very next day, poisoned. However, before Cixi could carry out her future plans, she herself passed away. Now a mere toddler had ascended the imperial throne. Naturally, none of this had any meaning to Puyi. From his perspective, a group of important-looking strangers had pulled him from his mother, dressed him in elaborate garments, and were now performing confusing rituals in his presence. But there was a reason behind all this. Puyi was no longer seen as just a regular child. From this moment forward, everyone around him would treat him as if he were divine, a living deity. 3 years passed, and by age 5, this is how a typical day in Puyi's life might unfold. He awakens atop a grand kang, a raised sleeping platform where he lies each night beside Nurse Wang. It's time for him to be dressed, and tradition dictates that he can never wear the same clothes twice. His outfit from the previous day, a silk tunic, a padded vest, a sable-trimmed jacket, and a coat made of fur, has already been discarded. Naturally, Puyi does not dress himself. As with all things, the eunuchs handle it. They serve him in every aspect. To work within the Qing imperial palace, one had to be a eunuch, which meant undergoing castration, the removal of the penis, scrotum, and testicles. This ensured that the emperor remained the sole fertile male within the palace walls, thereby guaranteeing that any child born there would be his alone. Eunuchs, as male Qing servants, were distinctly marked. Only those designated for close service to the emperor were permitted to look directly at him. All others were required to avert their gaze or stare at the floor. They were clean-shaven, their heads bowed low, and their voices high-pitched, since most had undergone castration before puberty. Because Chinese spiritual beliefs stated that a soul could not enter heaven unless the body was buried whole, these eunuchs carried their severed genitals with them in small containers filled with salt water. When the emperor felt hungry, a single gesture would prompt the eunuchs to instantly lay out a massive array of dishes. Then, as on every day, he had to pay a ceremonial visit to the eastern palaces where his other mothers resided. 5 women who had either been wives or concubines to the last 2 emperors. Reaching the eastern palaces required a formal walk through the city, always under heavy escort. Wherever Puyi traveled, he was surrounded by dozens of eunuchs. One would walk 30 yards ahead to alert others to move aside. Then came 2 senior eunuchs flanking the pathway. Approximately 2 feet behind them walked Puyi, attended by 2 junior eunuchs. Following them were imperial eunuchs carrying garments, parasols, and ceremonial coverings. More eunuchs trailed behind, bearing ornate boxes filled with pastries and rare treats. Then came the medical eunuchs of the imperial dispensary. Lastly, the rear of the procession included eunuchs carrying portable toilets and chamber pots. If, during the walk, Puyi suddenly needed to relieve himself, a eunuch would rush forward with a pot, then scurry away afterward to inspect its contents. Upon arriving at his destination, the palace ritual required that each of the consorts inquire about Puyi's health. Whether or not they sincerely cared for his well-being, however, was a different matter entirely. As for Lady Lu, she personally held the belief that Lady Longyu believed that young boys could be kept healthy by deliberately keeping them half-starved. She held significant influence over Puyi, being the widow of Emperor Guangxu, Puyi's poisoned predecessor, and acting as co-regent alongside Prince Chun. Within a few short years, she would exile Puyi's beloved nurse, Wang, without even permitting a final farewell. Though Puyi disliked all of the women considered his mothers, his disdain for Longyu stood out as especially intense. On the return journey from a visit, Puyi was in a sour mood and suddenly made a firm decision. 2 eunuchs had offended him, though It was never made clear exactly how, and he demanded that they be punished with a flogging. The two eunuchs were ordered to expose their buttocks, and two others stepped forward, each holding a stick. They beat the men right then and there, while Puyi observed with visible pleasure in his eyes. Later, inside the Hall of Supreme Harmony, the boy sat and listened as officials of the court recited endless formalities. They spoke about government affairs and presented documents filled with content beyond Puyi's understanding. Each paper required the emperor's official seal. Under close supervision by his tutors and the chamberlain, Puyi repeatedly stamped the documents. To him, the process was confusing and incredibly dull. In truth, all actual power rested with Prince Chun, the acting regent, who made every decision, yet every decree still had to bear the seal placed by Puyi's small hand. Finally, after what felt like hours of exhausting talk and formality, the child emperor was released and eager to be amused. Though he had no true friends, the eunuchs served as both his servants and his entertainers. One of Puyi's favorite eunuchs performed a puppet show, which he adored. Inspired, Puyi wanted to reward the performer with a cake, but before giving it, he asked Nurse Wang to hide sharp metal shards inside. He claimed he wanted to see the eunuch's reaction when he bit into it. Wang, however, managed to persuade him to use dried beans instead. Soon after, Puyi asked for his air rifle, searching for something to shoot, and settled on targeting the eunuchs. But after some time, even shooting at his servants grew dull. Spotting a speck of dirt on the floor, he pointed to it and told a eunuch, "Eat that for me." And when someone believed to be a living god made such a command, the only acceptable response was to kneel down and obey, even if it meant eating dirt. At night, the young boy felt his only real sense of safety when curled in the arms of Nurse Wang. Occasionally, he would think of his biological mother, though the memory was already fading, and he wouldn't be permitted to see her again until the age of 13. Puyi's life was one of deep isolation, and he remained completely unaware that outside the sacred walls of the Forbidden City, the nation he was meant to rule was in the grip of violent upheaval. It was now October of 1911, and in the city of Wuchang, rebellious soldiers had turned against their corrupt commanders. What began as a mutiny quickly swept across the entire country, escalating into a widespread revolution against the Qing dynasty. The Chinese populace had reached their breaking point. Following 4 devastating wars and increasing invasions by Western powers, China had lost significant territory. The majority Han Chinese people had long resented Manchu rule, and now they began to imagine a future under a unified republic. The final blow came when the imperial military changed allegiance, choosing to support the revolutionaries and leaving the dynasty defenseless. By February of 1912, Prince Chun stepped down from his regency. Empress Dowager Longyu likewise relinquished her power and consented to Puyi's formal abdication. Just like that, the Qing dynasty ceased to exist, and China officially became a republic. With the end of imperial rule came newfound press freedoms, and newspapers rapidly emerged across the country. Almost overnight, media outlets representing every faction began shouting over one another, creating a chaotic and sharply divided media environment. If that sounds familiar today, it's because it is. Political polarization and ideological echo chambers have contributed to historically low levels of public trust in the media. However, a modern solution has emerged. Ground News, today's sponsor, has developed a one-of-a-kind app and website that shows how different news outlets around the world report the same story, while also offering transparency on each source's political bias, trustworthiness, and whether it's backed by state influence. At Fern, we believe Ground News is an excellent tool for cutting through the noise and forming your own conclusions. That's why we've secured a 40% discount for you on the same Vantage plan we personally rely on. Visit ground.news Fern, or simply scan the QR code to subscribe. The link is also available in the video description. But what about Puyi? Was this truly the end of his reign? Not exactly. For many traditional Chinese citizens, the notion of a nation without an emperor felt unnatural, and the idea of dismantling the monarchy altogether was unthinkable. As a result, the new Republican leaders struck a deal with the remnants of the imperial family. Puyi could continue residing within the Forbidden City, retain his household staff and his private wealth, and receive a generous annual stipend, equivalent to around $344 million today. Though he had formally stepped down from power, he still sat on the imperial throne and continued affixing the royal seal to official papers. However, these documents now concerned trivial matters: employee promotions, the movement of trees, and instructions on when eunuchs should change their attire. The Forbidden City gradually turned into a place of elaborate fantasy, one that resembled a luxurious prison, one Puyi would soon wish to escape. 8 years later, a smartly dressed British man stepped inside the Forbidden City, bringing unexpected upheaval. His name was Reginald Johnston, an esteemed scholar of Chinese language and literature, a poet and a skilled calligrapher. Johnston had been appointed to teach English to the Emperor of China. But beyond language, Johnston began secretly introducing Puyi to Western philosophy and global history. Until this point, Puyi's education had been limited strictly to the Chinese literary canon. Under Johnston's tutelage, however, the young monarch grew increasingly captivated by British culture, and his lifestyle began to transform. Traditionally, male subjects of the Qing dynasty were required to wear the queue hairstyle. But Puyi eventually cut his off, an act of deep defiance against imperial custom. He adopted Western attire resembling an English gentleman and started mixing English and Chinese in conversation. From that point on, he insisted on calling himself Henry. He began wearing glasses, something the dowager consorts disapproved of. He pedaled a bicycle through the imperial courtyards and developed a fondness for cinema. But above all, he became obsessed with a peculiar new Western invention, the telephone. He would make anonymous calls to residents in Beijing and hang up before revealing his identity. On one occasion, he even ordered food to a fake address, possibly committing the first prank call by royalty in recorded history. As Puyi's awareness of life beyond the palace grew, so did his yearning for freedom. He declared that once he was old enough, he intended to study abroad at Oxford University, just like his mentor Johnston. On June 3, 1922, Puyi attempted to realize that dream. He asked Johnston to help him escape from the Forbidden City. But, surprisingly, the same man who had planted these ambitions in Puyi's heart declined to assist. Johnston feared that helping Puyi leave would cost him his own prestigious position and its benefits. Puyi had no one else to turn to. What he didn't yet grasp was that the grip around him was tightening. The dowager consorts, who relied on his status for their own survival, had already taken measures to ensure he could never flee. They found a perfect way to trap him, by forcing him into marriage. Puyi, just 16 years old, had to choose a bride. His only option was to select one from 4 small photographs, hand-picked by the dowager consorts. The images were tiny, the women's faces barely discernible. Still, Puyi made his choice by drawing a circle around one. He circles the image of the girl he finds attractive. Her name is Wan Rong, a 12-year-old Manchu aristocrat. However, the dowager consorts don't consider her ideal as the empress. Although she comes from noble lineage, she lacks the wealth they deem appropriate for such a role. Puyi makes another choice. This time he selects a 15-year-old from a prestigious, affluent family. The consorts approve of this decision. Her name is Wan Rong. There are only 2 small photographs. One will become his empress and the other will be appointed as his secondary consort. He is encouraged to examine other pictures to pick additional concubines, but Puyi declines. He believes one is sufficient. After making his selections, the images are taken away and he won't lay eyes on either girl again until the night of the wedding. A few months later, following the wedding, Puyi finds himself alone with his new wife for the first time. He has no prior experience with women. On what should be their wedding night, he is expected to consummate the marriage, but he has no idea what to do. No one has ever explained it to him. Panicking, he flees the room. That night, Puyi fails to consummate the union, and it's quite likely that he never did. Years later, his younger brother would explain that the former emperor was physically incapable of fathering children. This could have been a medical truth, but many historians believe this may have been a euphemism, suggesting that Puyi was, in fact, homosexual. The years following Puyi's abdication are marked by disorder. The first premier of the Republic proclaims himself emperor, only to abdicate shortly afterward, and within 6 months, he is dead. All the while, warlords rage across the nation, and foreign powers continue to expand their economic and territorial grip via concessions. China is shattered, weak, fractured, and lacking central leadership. In November 1924, one of these warlords seizes control of Beijing and evicts Puyi from the Forbidden City. Though he's allowed to keep his private funds and receive government payments, his reign as emperor has officially ended. At 18, Puyi doesn't find this entirely disheartening. He's longed for a normal life, and now, as a private citizen, he believes he's finally free to live it. But the freedom he imagined would turn out to be vastly different than the reality he faces. More than 2 decades later, Puyi would find himself incarcerated in a Chinese prison, specifically the Fushun War Criminals Management Center. The imperial dynasty is gone. The republic, too, has vanished. Following a brutal civil conflict, Mao Zedong and the Chinese Communist Party have assumed power and established a network of re-education centers across the country. These are harsh prisons and labor facilities meant to indoctrinate perceived enemies into communist ideology. Prisoners either adapt and adopt these teachings or perish in the process. Puyi is now just another inmate. Known as Prisoner 981, he is frail and pitifully inept. Only recently has he learned to perform basic tasks like tying his shoelaces or brushing his teeth. He's disorganized and frequently forgets simple things, such as turning off a tap after using it. Before 1950 and his incarceration, these were never tasks he had to do. Others did them for him. After all, he had once been worshipped as a living deity. Now, like countless others, he's enduring so-called ideological transformation. He has written a report detailing Japanese atrocities committed in Manchuria. He has attended presentations given by former Japanese war criminals. And as he absorbs these truths, he begins to understand that he, too, holds responsibility. This man Puyi is recognized in the prison as traitor number 1. After his expulsion from the Forbidden City, he aligned himself with the Japanese. At first, they placed him in Tianjin, and later they installed him as the ruler of Manchukuo, their puppet regime in the region of Manchuria, which Japan had invaded in 1931. For over a decade, he served as a figurehead emperor, once again under external control, lending legitimacy to Japan's extensive list of wartime atrocities in the region. When Soviet forces invaded Manchuria in 1945, Puyi was apprehended and stood trial as a war criminal at the International Military Tribunal for the Far East. During the proceedings, he resorted to blatant falsehoods in a desperate attempt to protect himself, disowning any accountability for his actions as a sovereign leader and shifting all the blame onto the Japanese, his former collaborators. After the Chinese Communist Party assumed power in 1949, the Soviet Union handed Puyi over to the new Chinese regime. Now imprisoned in Fushun, he was undergoing a process the communists called remolding. To the party, Puyi represented everything they were fighting against: a human embodiment of lavish imperial excess and capitalist corruption. Transforming him into a committed communist would symbolize the ideological triumph of the revolution. Puyi would spend 9 years confined within the prison camp, attending indoctrination lectures, wrestling with the weight of his past, and documenting his confessions and wrongdoings. Eventually he was released. Frail, diminished, and seemingly transformed, Puyi now professed unwavering loyalty to communism. At least that's what he claimed. After his release, he went to live with his sister in Beijing. On one occasion, he even worked as a tour guide inside the Forbidden City, the very palace where he had once been crowned as the sovereign of the Qing dynasty, an empire that had ruled over nearly a third of the global population. Now just an ordinary citizen, Puyi eventually took up a job as a gardener, quietly tending to plants and perhaps finally experiencing a form of peace. Over the course of his life, Puyi wore countless identities. As a toddler, he was deeply traumatized by an abrupt removal from his home. As a child, he found perverse amusement in tormenting innocent household staff. As a teen, he longed to study at Oxford. As the Emperor of Manchukuo, he participated, either passively or actively, in atrocities committed under Japanese control. Later, as a prisoner, he expressed sorrow and contrition. He passed away on October 17, 1967. All of this is presented by Fern History. Related content is available for you, with recently uploaded segments that include scenes of city servants, palace guards, and the Chamberlain of the imperial household. These individuals were part of an official security entourage, not heading out to escort someone away, but instead dispatched on a mission to retrieve someone. They traveled north until they arrived at a red-gated estate, the residence of Prince Chun. The prince had no idea they were coming, but the imperial convoy wasn't there for him. They came for his 2-year-old son. Frightened by the unfamiliar faces, the small child hid in a cupboard. The servants tried to coax him out, but the boy resisted fiercely. He cried out in terror, fought back with scratches, screamed and sobbed uncontrollably. When they finally succeeded in calming him, they brought him to the Forbidden City. This frightened toddler had just been selected to ascend the throne of China. His name was Puyi. He was destined to become the next emperor of the Qing dynasty, a position that would cause the Chinese people to view him as a living deity. This segment draws heavily from Edward Baer's outstanding book, The Last Emperor. The link is provided in the description. The coronation ceremony unfolds, and the boy emperor is overwhelmed. Time seems to stand still as a procession of unfamiliar faces approaches him, officials, palace guards, and ministers speaking in strange, indecipherable phrases. Each man approaches, bows deeply, kneels 3 times, and then touches his forehead to the floor 9 times in the traditional kowtow. They each swear allegiance, offering pledges of loyalty that mean absolutely nothing to the 2-year-old child. To Puyi, it is all terrifying and incomprehensible. The only person who might have comforted him during this ordeal, the one figure who brought him peace and reassurance, is missing. His birth mother is forbidden from seeing him, and in her place is a woman named Wang, who has taken on the role of his wet nurse. She plays with him, nurses him, sleeps beside him. She is his closest companion and emotional anchor. But during the coronation, she's kept away, excluded entirely from the ceremonial proceedings. He had been born into this place, and it was all meant to belong to him. As with all male subjects of the Qing dynasty, the eunuchs within the palace were bound by strict rules. Only a very specific group of imperial eunuchs had the right to lay eyes upon Puyi. The rest were required to avert their gaze or look down in his presence. None of these men had facial hair. Their heads were perpetually lowered, and their voices were unnaturally high-pitched, most having undergone castration before reaching puberty. According to long-standing custom, it was believed that a person's soul could not ascend to heaven unless they were buried whole. Because of this, eunuchs kept their severed genitalia preserved in jars filled with salted water, always close at hand. When the emperor felt hunger, a mere signal was enough to send the eunuchs scrambling to prepare an enormous banquet for him. As part of his daily routine, he also had to pay his respects at the eastern palaces, where his other mothers resided, 5 women who had either been married to or concubines of the last 2 emperors. To get there, Puyi would embark on a ceremonial walk through the Forbidden City, always flanked by an entourage of eunuchs. Wherever he moved, a eunuch would walk 30 paces ahead to clear the path and shout warnings to stand aside. 2 high-ranking eunuchs walked directly along the route's edge, followed by Puyi himself, positioned 2 feet behind them, walking, with 2 junior eunuchs in close attendance. Behind him came more members of the imperial household staff, eunuchs carrying his clothing, a parasol, and a decorative canopy. Then came others carrying trays of desserts and snacks, followed by the imperial medical eunuchs, and finally, a trailing group hauling chamber pots and portable commodes. If, at any point along the route, Puyi needed to relieve himself, the eunuchs would leap forward with a chamber pot, then whisk it away to examine its contents. Upon arrival at the eastern palaces, Ritual dictated that each of his mothers inquire about his well-being, though it was never quite certain whether any of them truly cared. One of them, Luyu, believed young boys should be kept in proper health by being nearly starved. She wielded considerable influence over him, being the widow of Emperor Guangxu, Puyi's predecessor, and serving as co-regent alongside Prince Chun. In time, she would exile Puyi's cherished nurse Wang, forbidding her even a final goodbye. Puyi detested all of his mothers, but he held a particular bitterness for Luyu. On the return walk, feeling moody and displeased, Puyi suddenly made a decision. Two of the eunuchs had angered him. Though the offense was unclear, Puyi demanded they be punished. The two eunuchs were ordered to bare their backsides. Two others stepped forward, each holding a rod, and began to beat them publicly. Puyi observed the spectacle with a glimmer of joy in his eyes. Back in the Hall of Supreme Harmony, he was once again subjected to the endless droning of court officials who discussed matters of state he couldn't begin to understand. They presented official documents, all requiring his imperial seal. Over and over again, Puyi stamped them under the close supervision of his tutors and the palace chamberlain. It was baffling and excruciatingly dull. Though Prince Chun, as regent, held the actual authority and made all important decisions, the seal had to come from Puyi's hand to maintain the illusion of power. After long hours of tedious formality, Puyi was finally free. He now craved amusement. He had no real friends his own age, so the eunuchs became not only his servants, but also his entertainers. One eunuch, his favorite, performed a puppet show, something Puyi adored. Inspired, he decided to reward the performer with a cake. But before giving the treat, he instructed Nurse Wang to hide sharp metal shards inside it. He told her he wanted to see the eunuch's face when he bit into the painful surprise. Nurse Wang managed to talk him down and replaced the metal with dried beans instead. Still seeking distraction, Puyi then requested his airgun. Searching for a target, he aimed at the eunuchs. But that game grew stale quickly. Soon, he spotted a speck of dirt on the floor, pointed at it, and commanded one of the eunuchs, "Eat that for me." And when a living god gives an order, even one that involves consuming filth, the only response is to kneel and obey. Nighttime was when the young boy felt the most secure, nestled in the comforting embrace of his caretaker, Nurse Wang. On occasion, he still longed for his biological mother, though his recollection of her had already begun to fade. He wouldn't be granted another visit with her until he turned 13. Puyi's existence was one of deep solitude. He remained unaware that beyond the towering walls of the Forbidden City, the realm he was nominally the emperor of, the nation was unraveling. The month was October 1911. In the city of Wuchang, a faction of disillusioned soldiers revolted, turning on their corrupt superiors. This mutiny quickly fanned into a nationwide insurrection, rapidly transforming into a sweeping rebellion against the imperial dynasty. The Chinese populace had reached its breaking point. Following 4 wars and mounting pressure from Western intrusions, China's land had been significantly diminished, and the majority Han ethnic group had grown increasingly resentful of centuries-long Manchu domination. The dream of a unified republic began to take hold. Then, in a decisive moment, the imperial army defected, choosing to support the rebellion, leaving the Qing regime defenseless. By February of 1912, Prince Chun resigned from his regency, and Empress Dowager Longyu formally stepped down, consenting to bribe. But is this really the conclusion of Puyi's rule? Not entirely. For much of China's traditional society, the concept of a country without a sovereign was foreign, even absurd. To eliminate the monarchy outright seemed unimaginable. Therefore, the new government struck a compromise with the former imperial family. Puyi would be permitted to remain in the Forbidden City, retaining his staff, private wealth, and an annual stipend, equivalent to around $3.44 million today. Though officially dethroned, Puyi continued to occupy the imperial throne and affix his seal to palace decrees. However, these decrees now pertained only to trivial domestic affairs, staff appointments, planting trees, or decisions on when eunuchs should change their uniforms. The Forbidden City had transformed into a land of illusions, a splendid but confining cage. and it wasn't long before Puyi began yearning to escape it. 8 years later, a sharply dressed British man stepped through the palace gates, disrupting the divine stillness of the imperial quarters. His name was Reginald Johnston. An esteemed scholar of Chinese language, a poet and a master of calligraphy, Johnston had come to tutor the emperor in English. Yet beneath this official role, Johnston covertly introduced Puyi to Western history and philosophy. Up to that point, the boy emperor's education had been rooted solely in the Chinese classics. But now, under Johnston's guidance, Puyi began to develop a profound admiration for the West. Puyi became fascinated by British customs and began undergoing noticeable changes. Traditionally, all male subjects under the Qing dynasty were obligated to wear a queue, a long braid, but soon Puyi would sever his, an act considered a serious breach of imperial tradition. He began dressing like an English gentleman, blending English with Chinese in his speech, and adopted the Western name Henry. He also took to wearing eyeglasses, something the dowager consorts disapproved of. He pedaled his bicycle around the Forbidden City and grew enamored with cinema. But what captivated him the most was a curious invention from the West, the telephone. He would make prank calls to random Beijing residents, often hanging up before identifying himself. On one occasion, he even ordered food to a fake address, perhaps history's first royal prank call. With every passing day, Puyi developed a clearer image of life beyond the palace gates and the experiences he was being denied. He declared that once he was old enough, he wanted to go abroad and study at Oxford, just like his mentor. On June 3, 1922, he made an attempt to realize this dream by asking Reginald Johnston to help him escape the Forbidden City. But Johnston, the very person who had inspired these dreams, refused. Letting Puyi leave would mean losing his privileged position, influence, and comforts. Puyi had no one else he could turn to, and though he didn't yet grasp the full reality, he was being ever more tightly controlled. The dowager consorts, who also relied on him for their survival, devised a plan to ensure his escape would be impossible. They pushed him into making a pivotal life choice, selecting a bride. Puyi was presented with just 4 photographs, his only options, pre-selected by the consorts. At 16 years old, he had to choose based on these tiny, unclear images. He circled the picture of a girl he found attractive, Weng Xiu, a 12-year-old Manchu girl, but the consorts dismissed her as unsuitable for the position of empress. Although she had noble blood, she came from a poor background. So Puyi picked again, this time selecting a 15-year-old from a wealthy, high-status family. The dowager. Consorts approved. Her name was Wan Rong. 2 small portraits determined his future. One would be his empress, the other a secondary wife. He was urged to choose additional consorts by pointing at other photos, but Puyi declined. One was enough. The chosen pictures were taken away, and he wouldn't lay eyes on either girl again until his wedding night. A few months later, after the ceremony, Puyi met his empress for the first time. He had no prior experience with women, and on their wedding night, he was expected to consummate the marriage, but he had no idea what to do. Overwhelmed and unprepared, he panicked and fled. That night, the marriage went unconsummated, and evidence suggests it never was. In later years, Puyi's younger brother claimed the former emperor was physically incapable of fathering children. While that may have been true, some historians believe it may have also been a coded reference, suggesting that Puyi was actually homosexual. The years following his abdication were marked by political chaos. The first Chinese premier declared himself emperor, only to abdicate weeks later and die within 6 months. At the same time, regional warlords clashed for power across the fractured nation, while Western nations continued exerting control over China's economy and territory through concessions. The country remained splintered and leaderless. Then, in November 1924, one of the warlords seized Beijing and expelled Puyi from the Forbidden City. Though he was allowed to retain his personal wealth and would receive a state-funded allowance, his reign as emperor had finally come to an end. At 18 years old, Puyi didn't find this entirely disappointing. He had long yearned for an ordinary life. From that moment on, he would begin his journey as a private citizen. Now a private individual, Puyi believed he was finally free to live as he pleased. However, the reality of that freedom would be vastly different from what he had imagined. 26 years later, he found himself confined within the Fushun War Criminals Management Center, a Chinese prison designed for political re-education. The Qing dynasty was gone, and so was the Republic. Following a vicious civil war, Mao Zedong and the Chinese Communist Party had come to power, establishing re-education facilities across China. These were labor camps and prisons where perceived enemies of the state were subjected to intense ideological conditioning. Inmates were forced to adopt communist ideology or perish in the process. Fushun was one of those grim facilities. Known as Prisoner 981, Puyi was frail, inept, and incapable of managing basic tasks. He had only recently learned how to tie his shoes and brush his teeth. His hygiene was poor, and he constantly forgot to turn off running water. Prior to his incarceration in 1950, such tasks had never been his responsibility. They had always been handled by others. He had, after all, once been revered as a living deity. Now, like countless others, he was subjected to a process called thought reform. He compiled lists documenting Japanese atrocities committed in Manchuria and attended presentations by Japanese war criminals. Gradually, he came to understand that he bore responsibility for many of those horrors, because Prisoner 981 was none other than Puyi himself, now known as the prison's top traitor. After being forced out of the Forbidden City, Puyi had aligned himself with Japan. Initially relocated to Tianjin, he was later installed as the puppet emperor of Manchukuo, a Japanese-controlled state in Manchuria, which Japan had invaded in 1931. For over a decade, Puyi served as the symbolic ruler, lending credibility to Japan's occupation and legitimizing their countless war crimes. When the Soviet Union invaded Manchuria in 1945, Puyi was captured and tried at the International Military Tribunal for the Far East. In an effort to protect himself, he denied any personal accountability and placed full blame on the Japanese, his former allies. After the Communist Party rose to power in 1949, the Soviets returned him at Fushun. The Communists saw in him a potent symbol, an embodiment of everything they opposed: lavish imperialism and corrupt capitalist. If Puyi could be transformed into a devoted communist, it would serve as the ultimate testament to their ideological. He remained at the camp for 9 years, absorbing communist doctrine, reflecting on his guilt, and writing extensive. When he was finally released, Puyi was a diminished, physically weakened, psychologically subdued, and outwardly. He professed unwavering loyalty to communism, at least after his. He went to live with his. At one point, he even worked as a tour guide in the Forbidden City, the same place where he had once been crowned emperor of one of history's most powerful dynasties, which had ruled over nearly a third of the global population. Now truly a private citizen, Puyi later took a job tending gardens, quietly immersed in the care of. In this simple life, he seemed to discover a measure of the freedom he had longed. Over his lifetime, Puyi played many roles. As a toddler, he was traumatized by a sudden. As a child, he found joy in tormenting helpless. As a teen, he dreamed of studying at Oxford. As the emperor of Manchukuo, he was complicit in unspeakable. And as a prisoner, he presented himself as penitent and. Complex and turbulent journey came to an end when he died on October 17, 1966.